Deflation is the natural state of any free market. I make that statement to a lot of clients, to a lot of financial advisors. They nod their head like that makes sense. But yet, when I was back in college taking macroeconomics, we were taught, and they're still teaching this today, that inflation is required in any economy if it's to grow. Nobody ever stops to ask, why is that? Think about productivity. Think about technological advancement. Things should be cheaper. I always use the example of Hershey chocolate bars. Those are made in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I looked it up. I was thinking, how many candy bars did that same factory make 100 years ago? Turns out at the turn of the 20th century, at 1900, every one worker on the assembly line making these candy bars, pouring the chocolate and everything, made 20 candy bars per hour. Okay, that's probably not bad, 20 candy bars an hour. So then I looked up at what the modern Hershey bar factory creates. It's 42,000 bars per hour. Now, granted, the machinery's more expensive, but come on, 42,000 chocolate bars an hour? Chocolate bars should be cheaper. I can use many examples. Back when I bought my first PC, my first desktop computers, they had just been released by IBM. It was called a PC 8088. I was so proud when I first introduced the desktop computer to my financial advisory business. I was an early adopter. It was an inflection point at the industry. One of these times where before the inflection point, you did things one way, but after the inflection point, you did things a totally different way. The PC was that way. I was so proud that I got a computer that was twice as big as my uncle's, who was the first in our family into desktop computers. Mine had a 20 megabyte hard drive. I was so proud. Today, my phone has single images that are 20 megabytes, but I paid $1,200 for that computer back in 1989. And guess what? This computer that I'm recording this on right now cost about the same. I paid about $1,200, but it's got 3 terabytes of hard drive space. I'm paying the same amount, but I'm getting exponentially greater machine. But what if I were to look today and replicate that first computer that I got? What would that cost today? So what would a simple computer with a 20 megabyte hard drive cost me today if I could find one? It's about $50. That's deflation. So as productivity continues, we have improvements to technology, manufacturing, all of these things, prices should be going down. Now let's dig into why. I had a client make a comment one time that I never forgot. I was explaining how we were adjusting for the future prices of things. What he was saying was, I need $15,000 per month in my financial independence. When I stop working and start living off my portfolio, but I'm not retiring for 10 years. So he was trying to explain to me, I'm sure things will be more expensive. I started explaining to him that we take that into account in proper planning. But when I explained it to him, I explained that in our economy, the monetary inflation rate has been about 7% on average my lifetime. I actually took the time one time and I studied monetary inflation going back to my great-grandfather over 100 years ago. Guess what? It's averaged about 7% monetary inflation for a long time. Now, most people think inflation is something like 3 or 4, maybe 5%. Most advisors use something in that range. Let me tell you, that's consumer price index. That's the government's measure of prices. But see, the government keeps changing how they calculate that. Maybe it's 3% inflation today, as long as you don't spend money on food, you don't spend money on gas, you don't buy any electricity, and you don't include the rising costs of homeownership or rents. If you take those into account, and if I were to calculate inflation today, but using the government's calculation formula that they used when I got into this business, 1981, inflation today would be 10.69%, just measured the old way. So That's a problem. That's a planning problem. So what's the difference between monetary inflation and consumer price index? They are two totally different concepts. And I'm going to try to make a case today that monetary inflation is what you really should be keeping your eye on as you're creating comprehensive written lifetime financial strategies for your clients. What's happening with inflation at the monetary level is the government is printing money. We all know this intuitively. We hear all the time about the budget deficit and we're spending money that we don't have. How do we come up with that money every year if we're spending money we don't have? They just print new dollars. So we're printing money and we're in essence diluting. So that's what I want to focus on in this video. I want you to think about the concept of dilution. Now, if you're a financial advisor with a securities registration, you were tested on this. The concept of dilution, if we think about, let's say, equities, stocks. If I have a company and I issue 1,000 shares of stock and I raise $1 million capital raise for my company, now I have $1 million, but I've given up 1,000 shares of stock to other people, of which hopefully I own 51% of it. But if a couple years later, I decide we could grow faster if I raise more money, I do another capitalization, I take another $1 million into the company, so now I can grow faster, but I issue another 1,000 shares, anybody in my industry knows that's dilution. By doubling the number of shares from 1,000 to 2,000, those original shareholders have now just been diluted by 50%. Whatever percentage ownership they had in the company before, they now have half as much interest in my company because I diluted their stock. I want to give a couple of other quick examples. If you think back to how gold used to back money, all money was backed by some sort of a hard commodity, gold, silver, something like that. Back in Roman times, they used to make coins out of gold. The Caesar would coin these gold coins. That's how they raised such a massive army. They took over the known world pretty much at that time, but they were paying their soldiers in gold coins. But over time, human temptation being what it is, Caesar after Caesar going forward started adding other cheap metals to the coin. Just drop by drop, they'd add a little bit every year. And then at some point, people realized this is not solid gold. What they used to do is they used to drop the coin on a hard surface. If it was real gold, it would make a loud ringing noise. And if it had cheap metals in it, it would give a flat sound. It would just drop it and it'd go thud. At some point, the military stopped accepting these coins and they couldn't raise an army, and that was the end of the Roman Empire. That's dilution also. Before they started diluting the coins, a Roman soldier could take a gold coin in payment for service, go hide it under the mattress. They could come back 10 or 20 years later, and it was still gold. It was still precious and valuable. But by diluting the coin, it was not sound money. As a matter of fact, that test where they dropped the coin, and when it was solid gold, it would ring, that's where we get the term sound money. The final example I want to give you about dilution is, imagine this. Let's say there are 10 winemakers in the world who make bottles of wine that cost $10,000 per bottle. That's pretty good wine. But let's say 9 of the companies decide it's tempting, our profits need to go up, so we'll just start adding a few drops of water to the wine each and every year. So year after year, they keep adding a little bit more water. They're diluting the wine. At some point, people are going to taste it. If you have one manufacturer that is making wine the old-fashioned way, guess what? They get all the wine sales. That's non-dilution. So what's happening with money is, when I showed this to my client, how this is happening with the US dollar, that you put money into a fixed asset, and yes, you're getting interest. And when it matures, you're going to get that same nominal value. So if you put in $1 million for 10 years into a deposit account, let's say you earn 4 or 5% per year, sounds great. 10 years later, you pull it out and it's still $1 million. You gave them $1 million, they hand you $1 million. That sounds safe. The only problem is, what we know as advisors is, if you do the rule of 72, take 72 divided by the 7% dilution rate of the money, that money has half the purchasing power that it did 10 years before. That's dilution. From a planning standpoint, this catches up with you and it's a moving target. I'm going to recommend that you test this with a couple of clients. Go into your financial planning software, and instead of whatever inflation rate that you're currently using, use 7. Do a separate scenario where the inflation rate is 7. And oh, by the way, because medical science is growing exponentially, let's change that scenario to where the client lives a very long age. I recommend you put age 117. Run it out until the youngest spouse is 117 years old. By the way, why 117? Because as the time of this recording, that's the oldest human currently living. So there's at least a possibility with modern science that a person could live to 117. How does that scenario work out for you? If you run it at 7% inflation and living to 117, how does that affect the client portfolio? Are they able to achieve their goals by the target dates they've set? And if they start pulling out of their portfolio against that type of an inflation rate in a world where the money lasts a long time, how does that affect everything in the plan? My parting shot for this video is a line by the founder of the Rothschild Empire, Mayer Rothschild, who made this comment around the year 1800. He said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I don't care who makes the laws." So the fact that we live in a world where the US dollar is the strongest dollar in the world, but it is losing half of its purchasing power about every 10 years on average. Now, if we look at the money printing that occurred during the pandemic and periods of chaos like the global financial crisis, for example, it jumps way up. When I was in college, at the year I graduated, inflation rate was closer to 20% than it was to 15%. So there are points in time where inflation is much higher. I'm saying use an average. The average over my entire lifetime, and for 50 years before my lifetime, it's averaged 7%. So I use that as my call to action. Be aware of this, run a scenario, call it worst case scenario if you want to, but plan on inflation being substantially higher than most clients believe. They're thinking about CPI, Consumer Price Index. They think if my money just outgrows 3% inflation, I'm probably okay. But you know better through the concept of dilution that the money is being diluted. There is no top limit of the amount of dollars that they will print. They have to continue printing money. We have 37 trillion in debt. There's no option to not print money. We're spending money that we don't have in the current world, and then we have to keep printing money in order to maintain the global reserve currency status that the US dollar has and to keep up with our budget deficits year after year. So this is just a word of caution. My goal today is to give you an inspiration to be a little bit tougher on these plans and at least envision the likely case scenario is closer to 7%. And if we don't come in that high, consider that a margin of safety for each and every client. And you'll go to bed knowing that you've created a scenario for the client that if you can stick closely to that, then your clients have a lot greater probability of achieving their objectives without running out of money before they die. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you in the next one.